Well, it's an honor to be here with my friends and colleagues and new friend Frank Foer. I'm going to take a little bit of a different tack, and I'm going to focus on this as a law professor, political scientist. I often say you can tell whether I'm a law professor because I have opinions without data. You can tell I'm a political scientist because I have data without opinions. And you can tell when I'm a lawyer because, well, it depends what my client wants. So you can decide what function I'm playing here. I want to start off by, this is the lawyer in me, which is I'm going to preempt some of the objections to a lot of these kinds of, at any time I talk about the threat that the internet poses to democracy. And generally the objections run in three species. One, which is what you think is new is actually old, what you think is bad is actually good, and what you think is original I've actually published on already, right? And so that's the academics in the room, many of whom in here have published on this already. So yes, a lot of the problems I'm going to talk about, take things like fake news, hate speech, and the like, they've existed for millennia, right? But there is something new about the internet, and I want to focus on that. And we should, since there's a lot of pessimism here and a lot of criticism of the internet and the firms and the like, look, the internet still is a liberation technology. There are voices that have a microphone and have a megaphone because of the internet that wouldn't have it without it, right? And so just as it empowers hate speech and neo-Nazis and the like, it empowers what we in the First Amendment context often talk about as the poorly financed causes of little people. And three, you can decide as to how original my argument is, and wait for the book. Maybe it'll be more original then. I want to talk about three big questions that I see as motivating the sort of inquiry and concern as to the effect of the internet on democracy. And you'll see the sort of interplay between both the constitutional sort of questions as well as those of a political theorist. And the first is that I think the internet poses a fundamental question about whether the marketplace of ideas can be a test for truth anymore, okay? So one of the core questions that we who sort of teach First Amendment law, and I'll be teaching it to the undergraduates next year if you want to enroll, is that more speech, right, is going to lead to a greater chance that truth is going to win out. It's not clear that that was ever the case. It's certainly not the case when it comes to the internet world. The second point with respect to the democracy and the internet is, do we think that democracy, and it's related to the first, that democracy requires some basic agreement among the population on facts and basic trust in some institutions, right? And what we're seeing because of the self-selection into echo chambers as well as the widespread sort of phenomenon of fake news is that we have incredible distrust in all elite sources of information. And for that matter, we can't agree on sort of a basic statement of reality. And the third, which is particularly salient when it comes to elections, is to what extent does a democracy require, a sovereign democracy require that the political conversation leading up to an election is focused on humans, which is to say not bots, right, and citizens, as opposed to foreigners, like as in the case of Russian interference in the US election, right? And so those three questions sort of frame the anxiety that brought me to this topic. I should say I started going in this area and analyzing these questions from the standpoint of someone who is focused on campaign finance. And so I wrote an article about 4 years ago called, what was it called? Oh, will the campaign revolution, the campaign revolution will not be televised. And it was all about how the platforms are going to be the main campaign finance regulators in the coming years, and I think we're seeing that now as they try to deal with disclosure of foreign money and the like. So that was my entry point. But the way that I try to ask this question is, again, not to focus on all the kind of common pathologies that we're attributing to the internet and these platforms. Like I said, fake news has existed for a long time. Even monopolistic media sources have, and we've had certain newspapers that got us into wars, among other things. But what is it about the structure of the internet and the information ecosystem that we now inhabit that then poses unique threats to democracy? Okay? And so here are the features of that information ecosystem that I think pose these threats. The first, and most of these will be obvious to you, but again, the sort of trick is to try to figure out what the difference is between this world and the one that preceded it. The first is placing a primacy on virality as the new mode this sort of new currency of political communication. So what the internet does, its disruption, right, is primarily to take away the intermediaries, the elite intermediaries, whether they were the established media or political parties or other types of elite institutions that had been curating information for you, either through their newspapers, television stations, and the like. And so now with virality as the new coin of the political realm, the Cecil the Lion type stories and anything else that is able to trigger emotion in you, either positive or negative, are the ones that are going to get forwarded to you by your peers, and then they're going to be the ones that gain the greatest following. And to the extent algorithms then privilege viral information and punish that type of information which doesn't have that kind of viral take-up, then the types of communication that have that quality are going to be the ones that are going to be privileged in your news feed and the like. But virality is also married to velocity, right? Which is the speed at which you get information now is completely different than it was in the pre-internet age. Mark Twain is, if you look on the internet, is reported as saying, right, that a lie can make its way halfway around the world before the truth can put its boots on. He's actually, on the internet, he's attributed to saying that in 1917. Turns out he was dead by then. But you know, fake news. But there's something to that, right? Which is that, especially when you think about a democracy and about running an election, the fact that you cannot counteract false speech in a timely manner as an election, which has a certain date is impending, has real consequences for democracies and campaigns, right? So beyond that, not just the virality and the velocity of information, but also the privileging of anonymity online is something that's different than in the pre-internet world. We have a long tradition of anonymous speech in the United States and elsewhere. The Federalist Papers, published under Publius, any kind of, Mark Twain himself, right, published under a pseudonym. But what the internet does is it gives a microphone or a megaphone to anonymous speakers in ways that was previously unheard of. Right? And so to the extent we have a hate speech problem on the internet, and there's some sort of interesting research on how sort of hate speech is spreading online, as well as the bot problem on the internet, the fact that automated accounts, right, machines are producing information and elevating certain types of content for the audience, that is a function of the privileging of anonymity online, right? If you knew the identity of the speaker, then it would be harder for a computer to have that kind of power to sort of impersonate a human being, right? So virality, velocity, anonymity. The fourth is what we call homophony, but what you know as echo chambers, right? The ability to self-select into your own information environment. Now here, there's no question that to some extent this is happening, that we are, liberals are choosing to look at certain types of publications, conservatives others. There's a real debate among political scientists and communication theorists as to how different our internet lives really are from our offline lives. And part of this is because we've become more politically segregated across all domains of life, in addition to our online lives. In many ways, our online lives are probably a greater reflection of our offline lives. In some ways, there are people you're going to see in your Facebook news feed, right, who you probably would not see if you walked down University Avenue, right? Your uncle, right? You know who I'm talking about, right? And so there is the problem of self-selecting into certain types of topics, certain types of news sources, as well as the algorithms that then privilege relevance and engagement, as Frank was talking about. And that has a problem that feeds into that concern I mentioned at the outset about the inability to have a kind of cross-ideological conversation that would provide for the kind of marketplace of ideas as the test of truth. Fifth is the problem Frank talked about, which is monopoly. That the position of Facebook, Google, and to a lesser extent Twitter is very different than the companies of yesteryear. Yes, it's true we've had common carriers and we've had obviously the three networks, but the position of those institutions was fundamentally different. But read his book, since that's mainly what it talks about. I can talk about it in the question and answer. The final phenomenon, which I think is unique, in terms of the challenge the internet poses for democracy, is this question of sovereignty. right? I mentioned this with and we're all familiar with the what the Russians have did in the last election, and there's certainly a history of the United States trying to go and affect other countries' elections. None of this is new, but because the web is worldwide after all, it poses a unique challenge for democracies to run their election when anyone, anywhere in the world, could communicate to that country's voters and persuade them, as well as use bots, trolls, cyborgs, and the like to have the effect. All right, so what is to be done? And I'll just end here. It happens to be that there are 7 Ds of reform here. I didn't mean for this to be a very Silicon Valley or maybe even Tony Robbins way of marketing this. It's, a lot of differences between law professor and Tony Robbins. But here are the reforms that for it could be government regulation. For the most part, I think it's going to be within the platforms, and we're seeing some move in that direction already. The first is deletion, right, which is that they are going to delete certain content. They do this already, whether it's in hate speech, terrorist content, intellectual property violations. I was at a Warriors game, tried to put up a video of Steph Curry taking some practice shots. Automatically, Facebook prevented me from putting it up there. So when push comes to shove, the prevention of uploading content and the like is something that the platforms do. The second is disclosure. You've seen now that there's a bill, as Frank mentioned, to require greater disclosure of ads that are paid for with respect to campaigns. But there's going to be, I think, even more push within the companies, and Facebook has already announced that they're going to do this, greater disclosure of the source of all kinds of content. The third is demotion of content. And that's also been happening. And there has been, the platforms have made quite a few changes since the 2016 election, even if all of us would push them to do more. But Google and Facebook have made certain types of decisions as to what types of content can ascend on their hierarchy based on certain factors, and issues like persistent fake news articles is one of those factors. Fourth is delay. Krishna Bharat, who used to be the head of Google News, now is teaching here at Stanford, if some of you have been in his class, where he has a great idea about how to, when certain types of stories gain a certain level of virality, they should be automatically triggered to be seen by a human observer, right? So that you try to put the brakes on falsehoods from being pervasive. Next, and I'll combine these together. Our colleague here, Jennifer Pan, in the communication department, talks, and this is not a rosy recommendation, talks about what the Chinese do by way of censorship. It's not just deletion of content, but it's about distraction and dilution of bad stories. And you can see, to some extent, that is the Trump playbook as well, which is to change the topic and to move it to other foci. And the last is deterrence. I had never thought that as a law professor I was going to be invited to the NATO PsyOps conference, which I've now been invited to next month. But a lot of the talk there is about how to deter this kind of behavior, and particularly they're thinking about foreign intervention. The platforms have started to do this, but for example, by trying to remove the money flows to fake news websites and the like. But a lot more can be done in order to try to deter this kind of content. But in the end, I think we are stuck with some of these basic questions about how unmediated, viral, peer-to-peer communication online threatens the democracy. It's a fast-changing world, though. The platforms are responding. It looks like governments, both here and abroad, are responding. And so if the question is, can democracy survive the internet? The typical internet answer is, the answer may surprise you. So.